Dr. Nine will miss much with the congratulatory videos. Okay, it's 10 a.m. in South Korea, so maybe we could begin. And in the meantime, I'll keep track of Dr. Nine. My apologies. It's always very difficult actually to keep track of different time zones when doing international programs, especially in this era of virtual panels. Welcome everyone to our panel entitled Rethinking Crisis Management and International Cooperation Amidst COVID-19. It's organized by New Silk Road Institute based in Seoul in cooperation with Center for Interdisciplinary Research on China at Kunming University, and the program is supported by Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Korea and Korea-China Association for Cultural Exchange. So we have 6 experts with us. I'll introduce the experts later. We will have 4 great presentations on Korea, China, Japan, and United States. And we will have 2 discussants to talk about the contents of the presentations. First, we will begin with congratulatory remarks. Can we first see the program again before we move on? Can we see the program?
Sure.
Okay, so we will have the 4 presentations after the welcoming remarks. I'll introduce the presenters later. First, we will have welcoming remarks, I think in this order. First by So Young-gyo, who is the chairwoman at Public Administration and Security Committee at Korean National Assembly. So she's a parliamentarian in Korea. Followed by Haimin Jing, I think, the ambassador of People's Republic of China in Seoul. And then we will have Professor Im Hong-jae's welcoming remark. He is the president of Kunming University. And all of these welcoming remarks are going to be not online, I mean, not in real time. They're all recorded, and they will take 12 minutes in total, so not very long. So we will hear their remarks. There will be subtitles, and I hope Dr. Nine will join us in the meantime. Okay, we can begin the welcoming remarks. 팀장님 시작해도 됩니다.
안녕하세요. 대한민국 국회 행정안전위원회 위원장 국회의원 서영교 여러분께 인사 올립니다. 오늘 있을 코로나19 시기 위기관리 국제협력의 최고찰 국제학술회의를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 이런 회의를 마련해 주신 1:1로 연구원의 최재천 명예이사장님, 싱하이미 주한 중국대사님, 그리고 관계기관 여러분께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 코로나19로 세계가 위기에 직면했습니다. 이 코로나19의 세계 위기를 우리 국제 공조로 국제 학술회의를 통해서 극복해 나가야 합니다. 세계 인구 2,700만 명이 코로나19에 감염되었고 88만여 명이 사망하게 이르렀습니다. 그래서 오늘 있을 이 국제 공조의 학술회의가 더욱 의미 있다, 이렇게 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 저는 국회 행정안전위원회 위원장입니다. 대한민국의 코로나19를 극복하는 최선봉장이라고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 코로나19 극복을 위해서 공공의료를 확충하기 위해서 감염병 예방을 위해서 질병관리 공부를 질병관리청으로 한 단계 승격시키는 법안을 저희 행정안전위원회에서 만들어서 제가 방망이를 두들겨 통과시켰습니다. 코로나19 확진자가 나오면 병원으로 이송하는 책임을 지고 방역도 책임을 지는 119 소방대가 저희 행정안전위원회 소관기관입니다. 코로나 감염을 확산시키고 방역을 방해하면 법적 처벌을 하는 경찰도 저희 행정안전위원회 소관기관입니다. 얼마 전 있었던 4월 15일 대한민국 총선의 선거를 관리했던 선거관리위원회도 바로 저희 행정안전위원회 소속기관입니다. 이렇게 훌륭하게 방역을 제대로 해내었다고 해서 세계는 대한민국의 K-방역을 극찬해 주었습니다. 그러나 마음을 놓아서는 안 됩니다. 다시 또 한 번 코로나19 확산이 일어나고 있었습니다. 잠시 방심한 사이에 그런 확산이 일어났습니다. 이제 국민이 온 힘을 다해서 코로나19를 극복해야 합니다. 의료진, 그리고 봉사하는 분들, 그리고 방역하는 모든 분들이 하나가 되어서 코로나19를 극복해야 되었습니다. 코로나19는 지구의 반격이다, 이런 말도 있습니다. 자연은 결코 용서하지 않는다, 이런 말도 있습니다. 어쩌면 인간이 자연을 훼손한 대가가 아닌가 생각해야 합니다. 이제 코로나19로부터 인간을 지키기 위해서 백신을 만들고 치료제를 만드는데 국제가 공조해서 하나로 힘을 합쳐야 합니다. 그리고 지구 온난화 등 병들어가는 자연을 치유하기 위해 우리가 힘을 합쳐야 합니다. 국행정안전위원회 위원장은 예산과 정책으로 여러분을 지원하도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 오늘 학술대회가 더욱더 잘 치러지기를 기원하면서 여러분을 위해서 열심히 지원하겠다고 약속드리겠습니다. 여러분과 함께하는 국제공조 화이팅!
各位朋友，大家好！很高兴出席疫情背景下的危机管理与国际合作视频研讨会。我谨代表中国驻韩国大使馆对此表示祝贺，向共同主办此次研讨会的韩国“一带一路”研究院和国民大学中国人文社会研究所表示敬意，对为本次研讨会付出辛劳的工作人员表示感谢。2020年，一场新冠疫情使各国人民生命健康面临前所未有的威胁。面对100年最严重的全球公共卫生突发事件，在习近平主席坚强领导下，中国政府迅速果断采取超常规的防御举措，统筹疫情防控和经济社会发展，在较短时间内有效控制了疫情，不仅维护了中国人民的健康安全，而且为世界抗疫斗争做出了重要贡献。在全球抗疫合作中，习近平主席同文在寅总统保持密切沟通，就中韩共同抗疫、促进两国关系深入发展达成广泛共识。中韩两国人民守望相助，合作抗疫，诠释了患难见真情的真谛。两国率先成立联防联控合作机制，首创开通便利重要急需人员往来的快捷通道，不仅在国际上树立了典范，更为因疫情受创的世界经济注入了强大的信心与动力。本次研讨会将主题定为探索反思疫情背景下的危机管理与国际合作，具有很强的现实意义。纵观全球历史，人类的相互依存从未像今天这样紧密相连，面临的风险也从未如此频繁莫测。气候变化、 网络安全、恐怖主义、跨国犯罪等非传统安全挑战给世界带来现实威胁。类似疫情危机的全球性挑战，未来仍会发生。面对不分国界、不论国、不论民族的全球性挑战，推动构建人类命运共同体是符合时代潮流的正确选择。而推进“一带一路”建设，则可为各方团结抗击疫情、促进恢复经济提供重要平台。以抗击疫情为契机，中国将秉持人类命运共同体理念，积极开展抗疫国际和地区合作，深入参与全球公共卫生治理，同各方一道，加快推进健康丝绸之路和绿色丝绸之路，开辟“一带一路”国际合作更加美好的未来。借此机会，我愿提及数据安全问题。当今世界进入数据化时代，数据安全风险和挑战日益突出，成为国际社会普遍关心的问题。不久前，王毅国务委员兼外长出席全球数字治理研讨会，提出全球数据安全倡议，呼吁构建和平、安全、开放、合作、有序的网络空间命运共同体。这一倡议旨在维护全球数据和供应链安全，推动数字经济发展，为制定公正合理的数据全球规则提供蓝本。这也是中国为维护全球数据安全作出的庄严承诺。积极响应和落实，必将营造开放、公平、包容的数据环境，充分发挥数据对全球创新和经济增长的巨大推动作用，造福世界各国顶尖水平。希望大家通过相互交流与深入探讨，为探索疫情背景下的这一领域合作方案提出新思路、新构想，推动相关合作早结硕果。最后，祝愿此次研讨会取得圆满成功，祝各位与会者身体健康，工作顺利，家庭幸福。谢谢大家。
안녕하세요. 국민대학교 총장 이몽재입니다. 코로나19 시기 위기관리와 국제협력 재고찰 국제학술회의를 우리 국민대학교에서 개최하게 되어 진심으로 기쁘게 생각합니다. 특히 코비드19로 전 세계가 이제까지 경험하지 못한 위기를 맞고 있는 이때에 세계적인 석학들이 모여 코로나19 위기관리와 국제협력에 대해 성찰하는 시간을 갖는다는 것은 시의적절하고 매우 의미 있다 하겠습니다. 인류가 하나의 공동 운명체이기에 우리 모두가 코비드19를 성공적으로 이겨내기 위해 힘을 합해야 한다는 것에 누구나 같은 생각일 것입니다. 그렇기 때문에 코비드19 시기 위기관리와 국제협력을 평가하고 고찰하는 이 회의에서 발표될 저명한 여러 학자님들의 의견에 깊은 관심을 가질 수밖에 없습니다. 위기관리 분야의 세계 최고 전문가이신 레이 짜오 교수님, 루이스 K 컴포트 교수님, 네임 카푸쿠 연구소장님, 유신 킴 교수님, 또 주재우 교수님, 윤경호 교수님의 발표와 토론에 감사드립니다. 한국 1:1로 연구원과 국민대학교 중국인문사회연구소가 지난 6개월 동안 본 국제학술회의를 준비하느라 많은 고생을 하신 것으로 압니다. 최재천 이사장님과 취환 원장님, 그리고 윤경호 소장님과 관계자 여러분의 노고에 감사드립니다. 오늘 축사를 해주시는 서영교 더불어민주당 의원님, 또 싱하이밍 주한 중국 대사님께도 감사를 드립니다. 아무쪼록 이 회의에서 코비드19 위기를 조속히 극복하는 국제협력의 좋은 방안을 찾아낼 수 있기를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
I think we really had an opportunity to listen to very important points, especially by Ambassador. Okay, I thought something was happening on my screen. Anyways, so I think it was really important that Mr. Ambassador talked about a global initiative on data security and rulemaking in this area for open, fair, and inclusive data environment. And this coming from China, I think is very important. Maybe something to be discussed at the later stages of this panel. With this, now I'll begin the panel. While in the meantime, trying to reach Dr. Naeem. Our first presenter is Dr. Yushim Kim. Her presentation is entitled MERS Code to COVID-19 in Korea, Organizing for National Public Health Emergencies, in line with her recent publication. Dr. Yushim Kim is an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs and a senior sustainability scholar at Arizona State University. She has served as a co-editor of environmental policy for Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. Her research focuses on environmental justice and policy, as well as public health service provision and management. Her methodological interest is to explore the benefits and shortcomings of developing analytical tools that can structure the complexity of systems such as agent-based modeling, qualitative comparative analysis, and social network analysis. She and her colleagues published a book in 2015 entitled Rethinking Environmental Justice in Sustainable Cities, Insights from Agent-Based Modeling. I would like to welcome Dr. Kim.
Thank you. I'll share my screen, so I have to stop somebody's screen. How does it look? Does it look okay?
Yes, it looks just fine.
Okay. So thank you for the invitation to this important panel in the middle of COVID-19. This talk is based on my recent publication in American Review of Public Administration with Dr. Sung-Soo Oh at Hanyang University in Seoul and my doctoral student Chen Wang in Arizona State University. Just very brief background of this talk. My interest in infectious disease go back to a decade ago. In 2009, many countries experienced the H1N1A, and it was no exception for Arizona at the time. And I worked with epidemiologists, applied mathematicians, engineers to simulate government risk communication effort to the public during the crisis and to help the state tabletop exercise with practitioners using simulation models. About 5 years ago, another event, MERS in South Korea, got my attention. I met a group of researchers at Hanyang University in Seoul who was interested in my simulation research, and I proposed them to study MERS response network as part of their research project funded by Korea Research Foundation since 2018. I have collected, analyzed, and published the complex response networks organization in their national plans, as well as implemented during the MERS crisis with the computer scientists and engineers in Hanyang University. We are in year 2020 with one of the major events in human history called COVID-19. For the last 6 months, I have set up another research project focusing on United States COVID-19 policy and its impact on the population's information-seeking behavior on social media with the other colleagues in ASU and another institution in the United States. With this background in mind, I would like to talk about Korea's national infectious disease management system in today's talk. I'll start with the CDC definition of epidemic and pandemic. Both talk about the prevalence of a disease, but the scale of impacted area and population are different. Epidemic refers to the prevalence of disease within a geographical area, but pandemic refers to the epidemic that has spread over several countries or continents. The challenge of this definition is that the specific threshold to define what pandemic is not clear. For example, 2009 H1N1 and 2020 COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic by WHO, but I don't think MERS was the case. The number of cases impacted by the MERS was smaller than the two events that I just mentioned, but it was broken out in 27th century with a sizable number of cases and deaths. So some factual information about MERS epidemic and COVID-19 pandemic in South Korea. MERS in 2015 was a mind-boggling event from my point of view at that time when I was exposed to this event in terms of the number of confirmed cases, number of deaths and so forth. However, thinking about the event in the middle of COVID-19, I feel like it was a small episode. The size and the impact of the COVID-19 is much bigger than MERS epidemic. As you can see on the right side of the figure, Korea has 19,000 confirmed cases as of August 29 and 316 deaths according to the WHO information. For today's talk, I need to explain a piece of information which is very important. In terms of infectious disease, Korea categorized the risk as 4 levels. Blue as the lowest level indicate that there is an outbreak elsewhere while it is not imported to the country. Yellow means that there is a domestic case reported. Orange means that disease spread to other parts of the country. And red indicates widespread community transmission throughout the country. This risk assessment is very important because it is the basis of the country's response action prepared for and will be performed during the infectious disease outbreak. The national plans include organizational plans and response action that correspond to this risk assessment level. New Zealand has a similar risk alert system for COVID-19, yellow, 2 shades of orange, and red with specific measures to take in each level. Not every country has such a warning system. The United States does not have one for public health risk. Looking at how South Korea planned for and responded to this event organizationally can be useful for other countries and future events. I will first look at the Korea's national plan on infectious disease crisis management system, prepared by the Ministry of Health and Welfare in 2014 December. I will then explain 2 interesting decisions Korea made during the MERS outbreak in 2015. And then the manual was revised in 2019, just before the COVID-19. I will talk about a few changes made by the Korean government in the revised manual. And then I will present Korea's response system to COVID-19 as of spring 2020. Let me show you an organizational chart in the manual, standard manual of the Korea, published just before the MERS outbreak. This manual defines which organization and agency, especially at the central government level, are supposed to coordinate and collaborate with whom. Here, the solid lines meaning coordination and dotted line means potential collaboration between the agencies. At the top, there is an Office of the President, and then there is an Office of Prime Minister and Minister of Health and Welfare, and then KCDC underneath, and then there is a local government. During the emergency, different types of ad hoc organization will be formed in each of those agencies. It all depending upon which risk, what is the level of the risk the country assessed at the moment. Two interesting things that I would like to mention here. The KCDC was planned to be in charge of responding to the crisis at the yellow or orange level. At the red level, the Ministry of Health and Welfare was planned to be in charge of responding to the event, collaborating with the Ministry of Public Safety and Security, which was established in 2017. The red text is what I inserted here by myself. It is written in the manual, but not explicitly in this organizational chart in the 2014 manual. Second, when the crisis became really serious, they plan to respond to it by creating Central Safety Management Committee led by the Office of Prime Minister. This was their plan before the MERS. During the 2015 MERS event, Korean government made two interesting decisions. First, they responded to the event at the yellow level until the end of the crisis, even though MERS case was confirmed in other parts of the country. So there was some discrepancy between what they planned and what decision that they made with regard to assessing the risk in the country. And second, they created an ad hoc organization called Central MERS Management Headquarters. This ad hoc headquarters was not the organization in the standard manual that is so. This organization looks like sort of combination of functions of the headquarters that was supposed to be established in KCDC at yellow or orange level, and the one in that was supposed to be established in the Ministry of Health and Welfare at red level. This was very interesting ad hoc organization that Korean government created at that time. This event has been largely considered to be failed response by many scholars. Major critique was given to coordination problem and authority conflicts. Some of the conflict were related to resource mobilization issue between different jurisdictions and localities. Other conflicts were related to who has authority over critical health information and necessary decisions. There were conflicts between the central government and city of Seoul. There were conflicts between the government and major hospital that was dealing with the MERS patient. Just before the COVID-19 and saw some modification in their national plan. Three things are worthy of pointing out here. First, the system chart explicitly include which organization is gonna be in charge of the response at which risk level. Second, unlike the previous plan, they have a clear organizational plan for the large scale event. Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters will be led by the Prime Minister or the Minister of the Interior and Safety. And the third, they also separate out local disaster and safety countermeasure headquarters from local government, but still led by the mayor or governor of the local area. Those are the major changes that I saw from the revised manual. And here, during the 2020 COVID-19, Korea escalated the risk level to red level on February 23rd, and Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters has led the response for a while. Before this headquarters was established, headquarters at the KCDC was established on January 20, on the day that they had the first outbreak. And Central Disaster Management Headquarters in Ministry of Health and Welfare on January 27. It all corresponds to the risk level elevation. The confirmed case peaked on February 29 and has been decreased. Korea used to have less than 10 confirmed cases per day for a while, which most of them are those who enter into the country from outside rather than domestically transmitted cases, until the resurgence of clusters of cases in August 2020. I think the number of confirmed cases these days is about less than 200. There is another way to represent the response system implemented at the ladder level on the right side. You see that KCDC is a big part of the system, but there is a head of the Minister of Health and Welfare as the first vice head, and Minister of Interior and Safety as the second vice head, under the leadership of Prime Minister. The head of the Minister of Health and Welfare as the first vice head, rather than head of the Minister of Interior and Safety, is different from their national plan we saw. The local disaster and safety countermeasure headquarters are also established and working with the central headquarters. There's no significant coordination or authority conflict that I am aware during the early stage of this COVID-19 in South Korea. So let me summarize a few lessons that I learned from these two events in Korea. First, it is really difficult to project the scale of emerging infectious disease in advance because its contagious nature and its exponential growth, as well as the ability to cross the geographical boundaries. We hope that our response system can adapt and evolve accordingly. However, assessing the risk is not an easy task, especially when you don't have much experience with emerging infectious disease. Even if the risk was accurately assessed, whether the government and other organizations can perform the response as planned, or whether they should perform as planned is quite different questions. What Korea's case taught is that this ability to assess and respond to infectious disease can be improved, as we saw from MERS to COVID-19. Second, during the MERS response, Korean government learned that both quarantine and administrative and financial support are equally critical. These functions are separated in different government agencies. At the national crisis, countries may need more competent incident commander or unified command that can lead a different government agency. Without that, there agency at the various government level and across sectors. And lastly, 2015 MERS in Korea and 2020 COVID-19 in the United States are like prototypical example that shows we cannot look at the public health emergency simply as another disaster that we know quite well. We are seeing how risk and uncertainty contribute to the confusion and challenge of everybody's decision making, including policymakers and the public, and also how they can be manipulated by some of the players. It requires the management of the disease, but also the management of social disruption in unusual situation, which we really don't know very well. So the biggest lesson of this pandemic to me is that being a country that controls the outbreak well, momentarily is not going to address the global pandemic. In early spring 2020, Singapore responded so well at the beginning of the outbreak, but they were experiencing a spike again around April and May. Korea is experiencing the cluster of cases again in August 2020. We cannot stop people or the virus moving around across countries in this connected world. It requires global effort to be truly effective in the situation like this. But how? I don't have an answer. I think that this is the right time to discuss the question and make the progress to prepare for the next one that must come, but which we just doesn't know when. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. It was a great presentation. And now we have Dr. Kapucu with us. I'm really sorry, Dr. Kapucu and the rest of the panels. I gave the wrong time to Dr. Kapucu, but he was super efficient to join us in no time. Again, welcome. Dr. Kim's presentation was very important. I'm sure that the discussants will talk about it, but very briefly, I think what we learned from Korea's case, probably the most important lesson here is that one can learn from failures to make successful crisis management, as in the case of Korea's failure in responding during MERS crisis and currently doing a relatively good job during this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much. Now we will have the presentation by Professor Lei Zhao, entitled Promoting Global Cooperation in the Fight Against Epidemic with a High Quality Development of the Belt and Road. Dr. Zhao Lei is a professor of the Institute for International Strategic Studies of the Party School of the Central Committee of CPC. He is the PhD supervisor, director of the Institute of International Relations and the Belt and Road. He is a member of the International and Regional Studies Expert Committee of the Ministry of Education, a member of the Central Enterprise Youth Association, Deputy Secretary General of the Decision Advisory Committee of the National Ethnic Affairs Commission, and an expert of the Belt and Road Economic and Trade Cooperation Expert Group of the Ministry of Commerce. And last but not least, top young talent of the National Special Support Plan for High-Level Talent. With this, I welcome Dr. Lei Zhao.
Okay, very nice to be, very honored to be here to share my opinion on anti-epidemic and Belt and Road Initiative. My topic is promoting global anti-epidemic cooperation with high-quality Belt and Road development. The Belt and Road Initiative is a sort of public goods provided by China in its participation in global governance and an important practice for building a community with a shared future for mankind. On June 18 this year, a video conference on Belt and Road cooperation was held in Beijing. In his written speech in the meeting, President Xi Jinping proposed to build the Belt and Road into a cooperative road to unite countries and to meet challenges, a road of health to safeguard people's health security, a road to recovery that promotes economic and social recovery, and a road of growth that releases development potential. His speech pointed out a new direction for the high quality development of the BRI. First, unity is the foundation to build a road to cooperation that unite countries in the face of challenges. The COVID-19 epidemic is an accelerant for the major changes unseen in the century, and many international consensus have been subverted and reshaped. The epidemic is the third major event that has changed the world's agenda in the 21st century. The first two were 9/11 attack in the 2001 and the global financial crisis. Major events since 2017, such as a trade war launched by the US and Brexit, have exerted a negative impact on the international community. The COVID-19 epidemic has made the situation even worse, leading to a significant increase in instability and uncertainties. So many countries have therefore felt unprecedentedly helpless. Looking back at history, there are precedents for major international crises strengthening international cooperation, but also cases intensifying competition. So trust, peace, development, and governance deficits, and even solidarity deficits are serious challenges that all mankind needs to deal with together. So the Belt and Road international cooperation right now is facing challenges. In fighting against the epidemic, many countries have locked down cities and even the countries for public health regions. Many international cooperation projects have stopped. However, B&R will not stop. So it is necessary to strengthen the unity of the international community through building a global partnership of connectivity. So the implication of B&R is connectivity. To practice multilateralism and align with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it is necessary to precisely align B&R cooperation projects with the 17 UN SDGs, with particularly the efforts in extracting poverty and hunger, improving people's health and well-being, and boosting technological innovation. Second, health is a prerequisite to build a road of health and safeguards people's health security. Public health crises have always been a severe challenge for human society, and people's health is a top priority for all countries. The COVID-19 epidemic has led to the unemployment and dropping out of a large number of young people, with possible psychological trauma that will be difficult to heal in their lives. An ILO report recognized that more than 1/6 of young people worldwide have become unemployed, and 42 of those who are still in their jobs have experienced an income decline. Most of the countries along the Belt and Road are developing ones, which generally suffer from public health challenges. Statistics show that only 3% of medicines in Africa are produced locally, and 17% of the world's population lack adequate medical services. Therefore, in the construction of the Belt and Road, public health cooperation have been regarded as a fundamental task. In as early as 2015, the National Health and Family Planning Commission of China issued a 3-year implementation plan for promoting the Belt and Road health exchanges and cooperation. Despite the achievements on the above-mentioned efforts, there are still few landmark projects and blended projects on public health cooperation in the BRI framework before the outbreak of the epidemic. It is necessary to actively promote the construction of a Silk Road of health and create a community of health for human beings. The top priority here is to stop the spread of the virus and safeguard public health security around the world. In the post-epidemic era, the need for cooperation in this field among countries will increase sharply. In the framework of the Silk Road of Health, we must accelerate the construction of public health infrastructure and improve the efficiency and sustainability of global public health system and can benefit all mankind. Moreover, it is necessary to fully mobilize the enthusiasm of enterprise in all countries to give a land in building a community of health for human beings. It's also needed to further strengthen international cooperation on the prevention and the control of infectious diseases or maternal and child health assistance, vaccine development. We also need to provide public goods in the health fields such as health education and personnel training. Third, recovery is the key to build a road to recovery that promotes economic and social recovery. Due to the epidemic, the global economy will enter a period of a severe recession. On April 14 this year, the International Monetary Fund issued a report predicting that global GDP growth will shrink by 3% in 2020. This epidemic will proves to be the first worldwide crisis that could drag both developed and emerging economy into recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The epidemic has made BRI countries turning into inwards with shrinking demands for infrastructure, trade, and investment. Orders for many industry parks in BRI countries have reduced sharply, increasing the difficulty for them to attract investment. Many companies then have also switched to produce pharmaceutical materials. As far as financial support is concerned, international capital is generally constrained, and the international financial situation invests with caution. So it is necessary to encourage the construction of digital Silk Road and inject catalysts for economic and social recovery. It is necessary to strengthen the coordination of macroeconomic policies and promote an orderly resumption of work and production with the help of BRI. The initiative needs to put more focus on cooperation in sectors of digital economy, medical industry, and food safety, and cultivate new growth points in the fields of e-commerce, smart cities, artificial intelligence, and big data application, and strive to narrow existing digital divide. In short, this is a broad space for improvement in the Belt and Road digital infrastructure. A series of digital technology and service such as Internet of Things, 5G, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing will inevitably become the most prominent growth points in the Belt and Road international cooperation. Final, growth is a guarantee to build a growth path that unlocks development potential. The world economic growth is losing momentum with more complexity. The BRI is a successful example of inclusive growth in the global economy. In essence, it is to generate new demand and rebalancing the world economy through increasingly effective supply. The academic has affected not only policies, but economy, but also social psychology and ideology. Many existing imbalances and the fragmentation of the international trading system has become more and more obvious. It is necessary to keep strategic determination to build the Belt and Road. The BRI countries are very willing to cooperate, hoping to boost their own development through international cooperation. In the future, it is necessary to set high standards, improve people's livelihood, and align with sustainable goals. The exemplifying role of production capacity cooperation should be emphasized to help developing countries on the road of industrialization and modernization. Many BRI countries have put a priority on agriculture, but lack of public health service capacity. Therefore, we should strengthen the construction of featured parks, such as parks of agriculture industry and of pharmaceutical industries. We should further cooperate on food production and processing, agricultural product trade, medical and health, etc. So in short, the global academic has challenged this initiative in many ways, but at the same time, fully provides its resilience and vitality. So in this very special period, I think the Be Belt and Road Initiative show its importance, even facing lots of challenges, but its importance and the potential at the same time is obvious. So that's my opinion. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I'll leave detailed discussion to discussants at the end of our panel. But very briefly, crises usually bring individuals and states to a crossroads where they have to make new decisions, some changes. And Dr. Zawley talked about COVID-19 bringing us to a crossroads where countries have to make a decision whether they would compete more fiercely, whether this crisis would ignite a competition between them, or they will see this as an opportunity for more cooperation in emerging areas such as food safety, digital data protection, Internet of Things, very important fields. And he also talked about China's Belt and Road Initiative and how it facilitates connectivity in line with UN SDGs, and it came at a time when COVID-19 requires cooperation between states. So I'm looking forward to more discussion from our discussants. With this, let's have a 10-minute break. I'm sure you have many online meetings. Probably you teach online. It's difficult to be sitting non-stop in front of computers for 3 hours. So that's why we wanted to have an early break. Let's have a 10-minute break. You can turn on your videos and microphones, do whatever you want, and we will be back in 10 minutes.
柯老师啊，我这是赶鸭子上轿，我都不说英语了。他说的写的，我自己都觉得各有别扭。一会儿这样，柯老师啊，等到那个最后还半小时的互动环节啊，到时候你看我跟同学说一下，你就直接再回来的时候，你看能不能直接把那个你的视频就加进来。现在我看不到你的视频，到时候那个环节你来负责咱们对话，好不好？我估计他们也不会问什么太多的问题。我这个说这个太费劲了，我这个费老劲了。你就替我进行这样的环节，好不好？
of our panel. We had a very fruitful first session. I hope the second session will be as fruitful. First, we will have Dr. Louis Comfort's presentation. Entitled Cognition, Action, and COVID-19 in Japan, a Meso-Level Response. Dr. Louis Comfort is a professor at University of Pittsburgh, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She is one of the most prominent names in the field of crisis management. She is the mentor of many of the prominent names in the field. I think we have one of the top names in the field, which is an honor for all of us today. She is also a concurrent professor at Nanjing University. She was a concurrent professor at Nanjing University, a lecturer at University of California. She had been a director of Center for Disaster Management at Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And her areas of specialization are public policy, organizational theory and design, information technology, and policy. And she has done research in many areas, including Japan. So today we will hear about her perspective on COVID-19 response in Japan. With this, I would like to welcome Dr. Comfort.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here and bring it up. Here. There. Well, I'm very pleased to give this presentation. I've spent a lot of time in Japan, actually going back and forth a year at Kobe University with colleagues there, back and forth for 10 years teaching in a program of disaster management, and then, of course, reconnaissance trips for both the Kobe earthquake in 1995 and the 2011 Tohoku triple disaster. So it has been really very interesting for me to watch Japan and to watch the way in which they responded to COVID-19, which is actually a rather surprising case. And the title, Cognition, Action, and COVID-19 in Japan, really focuses on what is essentially a meso-level response. And oops, next slide, please. I think I'm not able to move it. Is there?
Maybe you could click right arrow.
Right arrow?
On your computer,
There.
I mean, yes.
Yes, okay. So Japan's response was honestly an enigma in Asia, because it is, of course, a developed country, third largest economy in the world, significant advances in information technology, etc. But to everyone's surprise, or at least to mine, it honestly came up with this middle-level response. And in the context, Japan was a neighboring state to South Korea, to China. Initially, it thought its island location would protect it from the rapid spread of COVID-19. So it did not adopt a national policy for public health measures to slow the transmission of the disease. It did make resources available in limited ways, but its primary strategy was literally to appeal to the public for cooperation and to adopt a voluntary approach, get everyone to be responsible, do what they should do, and essentially place the responsibility for enforcement at the prefectural and municipal levels, and relied on voluntary action by the population. So the outcome was essentially a meso-level response, which was neither high nor low on the global scale. And if we look, and I just took 5 countries here and ranking them, and these figures were from today from the Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 or Coronavirus Research Center. And we see almost 28 million confirmed cases, almost 895 almost deaths in the world. And the US, regrettably, is #1. Brazil is trading places with India for #2 and #3, and Japan, 44. And we look at, this is of the 188 countries in the world that are UN member nations, and South Korea is number 75. And Taiwan, a tiny little Taiwan, is 164th out of 188 countries. But this was a surprise to me when I actually did see it. So my question when I started this research was to try to identify what were the key factors that led to this unexpected outcome of a middle level response. And here, one of the key issues in my judgment is this gap between cognition and action. It wasn't that Japan didn't know about the virus. Of course it did. It followed the news in China and then the transfer to Korea. But there is this long-standing dilemma in decision-making about the gap between cognition and action. You can know something intellectually, but that doesn't mean you act on it. And this novel coronavirus is actually a striking case for us to study how nations recognize and respond to a lethal threat. And it's especially important because the only known means of reducing the threat is by collective action in the nation that is exposed to it. And this requires a learning process that means first you have to recognize the risks, so you have to understand it, but understanding it in terms of what it means not only for you, but also your neighbor, also other people. And this is then communicated to the community in a way that builds the social coherence that enables collective action. That then allows coordination across multiple levels of government and organizations, and it enables then the nation to bring the incident under control. So the challenge here is to recognize risk and to guide public action to take the disease under control. Now, this comes back to cognition. What do we really mean by cognition? It is the capacity to recognize emerging risks. And this is especially important in a situation of uncertainty when you don't know exactly what is happening, and then to act on the information you have. But cognition represents this flash of comprehension that triggers action in order to accomplish a clear goal. And it derives from both social and cultural conditions. You are able to recognize it if you have in your experience, for instance, in Korea, the experience of MERS, as Dr. Kim explained to us. But importantly, cognition initiates a learning process that enables the actor, whether it is an individual person or a group or an organization or a prefecture or a nation, to adapt to unknown threats. But there's a bit of a problem, and it is this learning process. And Herbert Simon, who is Pittsburgh's own guru, said, we can only create what we already understand. The hard part is to push what we don't know into areas where we can learn more than we already know. And so in uncertain dynamic contexts, cognition then represents that first step in solving complex problems. And it is like navigation. One determines where to go by knowing where you are. But importantly, cognition structures information in order to shape action. And learning depends on the intersection between the time available for action and the rate of change in the environment that you're experiencing risk. So in large-scale dynamic contexts like a national exposure to COVID-19, cognition moves from the individual to the collective scale as everyone needs to operate together. But no single actor or organization has all the knowledge or resources needed to solve that problem. And so cognition depends on the rapid exchange of information among actors, updates, and feedback to keep the process of learning moving. And in this way, it depends on the tools, the information available to exchange and validate information. So the one advantage the world has in 2020 is literally an almost global infrastructure to search and exchange for information, as we are doing right now tonight on this conference, video conference. And so if we look at Japan, what did Japan do and what were the key steps? And the first case was identified in Japan on January 3rd, 2020. And it was a man returning from Wuhan who was identified as being ill, tested, identified as having COVID-19, and placed under quarantine. Then, since he was in quarantine, Japan was tracking this carefully. Then for nearly 2 weeks, a period of nearly 2 weeks, in February, between the 4th and the 19th, a cruise ship with over 3,000 passengers was discovered to have passengers on it with COVID-19, and they docked in Yokohama Harbor, and presumably they were quarantined on the ship, but in fact, people had to come from shore into ship and to return to shore. They were providing, food and supplies and support. And out of that ship, there were 700 infected cases and 7 deaths. So in fact, that significantly increased the number of cases in Japan. Then in mid-March, there was an increase in cases literally coming from the cruise ship infections. But what Japan did was admirable at that time. They really implemented their local public health centers, and these are regional centers that provide health services to several municipalities in a prefecture. These centers, which were developed actually in the 1950s, when Japan had endured a really quite severe bout of tuberculosis. So they were familiar with identifying, testing, quarantining, isolating patients. And while the cases were relatively small, these public health centers, regional centers, worked very well. The difficulty is, as there was no national mandate, people in Japan were free to travel, the trains were running, students were going to class in campuses, and indeed, the cases in Japan began to spike. So we got, in late July then, a sharp increase in cases. At this point, the public health centers became overwhelmed, and the responsibility was shifted to the prefecture level, and there was literally no national lockdown in Japan. And if we look at, this is the profile of cases in Japan, literally from yesterday. And we see in Japan 2 big spikes where they managed it very well in early March. You get this spike, in May, and then it comes to a quite significant spike in August, and it's declining. But the difficulty was their response, which was the public health centers, really was overwhelmed. So echoing Herbert Simon's adage, Japan created what it already knew. It did what it knew how to do. It did that well, except the virus was so transmissible, and they didn't anticipate how rapidly it would shift from person to person and transmit throughout the country. So they relied on the regional public health centers to perform local functions of diagnosis and isolation of ill patients. That worked when the number of cases was relatively low. And they did rely on a strong culture of community and of protecting one another by wearing masks. They don't shake hands, they bow. This is much better for stopping the transmission of disease. And it was quite effective among the older generation, but among the younger people, less so. And bars and restaurants were open, the trains were running, and literally this was how the transmission escalated again in July. And at this point, the public health centers, which had been understaffed and cut by budget cuts in the country, and were literally became overwhelmed in this last spike. So the question is, what was missing in Japan's response? And here we do see actually what the previous two speakers were discussing. What was missing was the rapid consultation with the neighboring countries of Korea and South Korea and China, who had already experienced the disease. What did they do? How did they know? What did they learn about community transmission? Secondly, in Japan, unlike Korea, there was really a lack of use of information technology. And my Japanese colleagues tell me that, in fact, with these public health centers, they were sending information about cases and transmission back and forth into government agencies via fax. And so literally the slowness in which information was being exchanged was difficult. And then thirdly, there was a lack of recognition of the interdisciplinary requirements for managing this disease. Japan essentially treated it as a public health crisis and did not bring in the economists or the people in social services or the computer scientists to assist them manage the disease, or the interdependencies that were involved when people started using public transportation and transmitting the disease around the country. Then thirdly, and this is interesting, there was really an over-reliance from my observation, and I'm doing this as an outside observer, on instruction from WHO, the World Health Organization, regarding the severity of the crisis. And consequently, there was a missed opportunity for the early intervention to limit the transmission of the disease. It was interesting because here I think we get both an economic and cultural aspect, where my colleague in Japan asserted this, and this has to be anecdotal, right? That one of the reasons for the delay in the Japan and the reliance on the WHO was Japan was trying to decide whether it would hold the Olympics that had been promised and that Japan's government had invested heavily in. And they had booked rooms in hotels, they had made commitments. And the question was, if Japan, canceled the Olympics because of the disease, they would have to pay. If the World Health Organization canceled, then the hotels would allow them to do that. And we have seen this same phenomenon with canceling conferences here in the US. It becomes an economic issue as well. And so the real question is it possible to redesign the learning process? And here I'm thinking not just for Japan, but for every country that has experienced this crisis of COVID-19. And we can gain some insights from this brief review of response processes in Japan, is that timing is critical. So closing this gap between the recognition of the risk and the action they take is really critical. And then clarity in framing the problem and giving the same message clearly to all people is really critical. So what happened in Japan is that different generations were responding differently, and different groups in the society were responding differently. And thirdly, of course, leadership and organizational structure matter. The absence of national leadership in hierarchical administrative structure really crippled the national response. The regional strategy for public health centers was indeed effective, but it needed to be backed up by continual support, financial support, personnel support from the national level. So the critical task is really to maintain a platform for systematic monitoring, reporting, documentation, and analysis of events as they change the whole system. And here, the full resources of information technology that has been developed around the world, I think, is absolutely critical. And so one of the questions, literally, and I'm saying this as someone who spent a lot of time in Asia, China, Japan, I'd like to spend more time in Korea, is it possible to redesign a learning process for emerging risk, not only for Japan, but for the leading countries in Asia? And this we've already mentioned with the Belt and Road Initiative, because in this age of global transportation, trade, economic, social interdependencies, COVID-19 will end eventually, but other threats will inevitably emerge. Climate change is very real. I'm here in California today as wildfires are threatening the entire state. And we see the cost and the losses that will come in many countries of the world from climate change. And our real question is, can we imagine a world beyond nation states in which robust international learning centers like the Koopman University Center here collaborate to monitor the status of global health, to share information, technologies, and techniques to bring these threats under control? Can we use the insights of this pandemic to create a strong, coherent capacity for international risk management? The opportunity, and in my judgment, the obligation awaits for all of our countries. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this conference this evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Comfort. It was very insightful. In retrospect, I think it was a good idea to invite presenters to talk about different countries' cases, especially when I compare Dr. Comfort's presentation to Dr. Kim's, we see some interesting parallels and differences. Both in Korea and Japan, there was no national lockdown, for example. There was huge reliance on citizens and residents voluntary, them taking response voluntarily. But the main difference probably is that South Korea had learned its lessons from MERS and changed its responses, crisis response, which was quite lucky in a way that it was just before COVID-19. Whereas in Japan's case, the lessons learned, according to Dr. Comfort's presentation, is mainly from, or the experience comes mainly from 1950s tuberculosis response, which is probably quite outdated, and because of the small n problem, probably not the right case to be applied to COVID-19 response. And again, very important point in Dr. Comfort's presentation is that for cognition and action, there is the need for learning process, learning know-how from each other, both to identify the problem and to apply action. So it's really important that countries learn from each other's mistakes before they have to experience the problems themselves, which was probably one of the problems in Japan's case. Thank you very much again for this insightful presentation. With this, now I turn to Dr. Kapıcı's presentation, and I'm sorry once more that I gave you the wrong time. These days I do many programs with people from different continents, and it's always a problem with the time difference. I'm sorry again. His presentation is entitled From Command and Control to Network Governance, Emergency and Crisis Management in the United States. Let me introduce Dr. Kapıcı. Dr. Kapıcı is Pegasus Professor of Public Administration and Policy and former Director of the School of Public Administration at the University of Central Florida. He is also the founding director of the Center for Public and Nonprofit Management at UCF. Dr. Kapıcı's core research interests are network governance and leadership, decision-making in complex environments, organizational learning and design, and social inquiry and public policy. Dr. Kapıcı has published widely in areas of public administration, network governance, and emergency and crisis management. His work has been published in highly ranked journals such as Public Administration Review, Administration and Society, Journal of Public Administration Theory and Research, etc. Dr. Kapıcı served and currently serves in several journals' editorial boards, including Public Administration Review. And before joining UCF, Dr. Kapıcı received his PhD in Public and International Affairs from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs of the University of Pittsburgh, where Dr. Comfort is teaching. So, as I said earlier, Dr. Comfort is the prominent mentor of prominent names such as Dr. Kapıcı. With this, I would like to welcome Dr. Naim Kapıcı for his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Kadir. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. And again, thank you for the invitation. Sorry for slight delay. I've been in constant contact with Kadir, and I was hoping to present tomorrow evening in the US side, which is 10 February. This is a great opportunity in terms of sharing experiences from different countries. I was asked initially from Kadir to present brief background on the emergency and crisis management system in the US and focus on the COVID response. During the probably discussion sections, there are some initiatives, and the one is Dr. Comfort leading. She might probably mention some of the ideas that are coming from. This is actually network learning from COVID-19. Our friends in Korea, in Turkey, Japan, and US and different parts of the world are trying to get together, understand the way the governments and civil society organizations and different departments actually responded, understand the risk of COVID-19 and the way they collectively organize the action. Again, in 15-minute presentation, it's so difficult to present the US emergency management system background and applications to COVID-19. I'll do my best quickly to present the background briefly. And then, of course, as Dr. Comfort mentioned briefly in her presentation, US is #1, unfortunately, in terms of the cases. And we do have some substantial issues in terms of leadership and the operationalization of the existing system and reliance on professional crisis management in the US. I will highlight some of those. So emergencies and crises really a substantial test for the communities in terms of leadership, in terms of administration, individuals, as well as different levels of government and the private sector. So in the US, we had this command and control system. It worked in certain disasters. It didn't work in certain others. It's primarily focused on top-down administration and coordination. But it worked quite well in China in response to COVID-19. But somehow the federalist system did not quite function well in response to COVID-19. So there's more emphasis from the Federal Emergency Management Agency based on the experiences, and among the scholarly community in the US, emphasis on community resilience, emphasis on partnership and flexible administration instead of top-down coordination. So I will highlight the COVID-19 case. Again, this is known for almost every community, every country, every locality in the world. Everyone was watching it, everyone is trying to address it, and it became a substantial burden on the economy and a critical test to health system around the world. And most of the countries utilize very similar mitigation strategies and policies, such as physical distancing, or some call social distancing, staying home or quarantine strategies, as well as use of face covering. So briefly, what we have in the US is a very well-established emergency management system, similar to Japan, for example, in terms of seismic risk and earthquake disaster response. So the US built, based on experiences, substantial emergency and crisis management system, with FEMA being the lead agency in terms of natural disasters, FBI being the lead agency in terms of man-made disasters or terrorist attacks, and CDC being the major organization in terms of health disasters. But one thing was really unique, a couple of things were unique to the US experience. There were some innovative ideas after certain disasters, such as EMAC, Emergency Management Assistance Complex, which actually established in Florida where they live, and in terms of based on substantial failure of federal government, FEMA, in response to Hurricane Andrew. And we've seen, of course, world-known 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the government shifted its policy focus on, unfortunately, more terrorism. Then we had Katrina, and we realized investing more on law enforcement is not actually helping too much in terms of disaster preparedness. Now we had COVID-19, we've seen some reactionary responses to COVID-19, and as Dr. Comfort mentioned, this will provide probably substantial learning opportunities for the world as well as the United States in terms of how we can build better strategies, how we can build better collaboration opportunities in response to COVID-19. And again, this is probably one in the centuries. We haven't seen anything like this before. None of the countries experienced something before. Smaller scale in Korea, smaller scale in Taiwan, smaller scale in South Asia, but nothing at the global scale as large as COVID-19 we're experiencing worldwide. So we'll come on, one of the things is really any type of disaster and emergency is a quintessential role of government. So government needs to take substantial responsibility. Yes, the hospital system, the private companies, they need to be part of this whole system in terms of community resilience, but it is the government's job to guide and the monitor as well as lead the successful crisis response. And one of the things really critical to leadership at every level, and I will highlight some of those points. So this is just a depiction of a crisis management system in the US. It's a federal system, primarily emphasis on intergovernmental relations. States have substantial decision-making authority through governors and health departments. And of course, municipal government and cities and mayors, they do have their jurisdictional power authority, and the federal government. But everything needs to be coordinated at the federal level, state level, and the local level. And local communities just coordinate among themselves, state agencies coordinate among themselves. This is a very complex process to handle in response to major crises. As I highlighted earlier in the presentation, crisis, disaster bring a major test. Regardless how prepared we are, there needs to be a quick learning, quick decision-making, and leadership capacity for effective response. And the core highlight really the community resilience. And the entire world become a small community now with the interconnected transportation systems, the interconnected telecommunication systems. And when we mention community resilience, it becomes part of the entire world with international organizations, states collaborating with one another. And we haven't seen substantial coordination, collaboration, unfortunately, at the international community. One, this is not experienced before. Two, probably every country wanted to give priority to its own citizens, and we've seen something similar in the United States. Even though we do have this emergency management system compact, but state did not operationalize it. Every state impacted, and every state wanted to focus on their own citizens first. So this is a brief highlight using emergency management system as an example how the federal emergency management is at the top and community organizations at the bottom, and you have this organizational capacity, the social capital level of connectedness among individuals and communities in every society, and that helps build community capacity. But this community capacity needs to be mobilized and carefully facilitated by the government agencies from federal to local to build a substantial, effective community disaster response system. Real quick, the system, this is the slide we built with Dr. Comfort and Michael Siciliano, our colleague and friend at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Some ideas in terms of where we are. Even though we practice some of the exercises, we do have several policies and guidelines. Unfortunately, these were not clearly communicated from the White House, for example, clearly communicated from the central administration to state and localities. The guidelines were developed, but again, there was not a good, clear communication. So as I highlighted before, this became a global health crisis, and World Health Organization is supposed to play a substantial role in terms of information collection and dissemination among the states and helping them to coordinate their action. And the World Health Organization doesn't have that capacity, and unfortunately, some of the leading government agencies in the country are trying to reduce their support. That will probably make it even weaker in the future. And we do have the U.S. State Department, because of the travel and connections, engaged in crisis response to COVID-19. And the primary organization was the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, as part of U.S. Health and Human Services Agency. And White House built a task force led by Vice President Michael Pence, but it did not quite function as an advising capacity, and they did not really utilize professional health people and medical people in collecting information and building a system of response. And we do have Federal Emergency Management Agency, the emergency support function of public health disaster response, engage primarily, facilitate supply to health centers as well as medical centers. And at the state level, governors have substantial authority to make decisions, and mayors and the local health departments, and substantial critical decision making at every level in terms of balancing opening the economy as well as balancing the public health concerns. That wasn't an easy decision for any country. That was an easy decision for local agencies as well as the State Department. The major issue in the US within this federal system, the politics of disasters, we've seen substantial disconnect between the Republican governors, for example, or Republican mayors versus the central administration. There was not a coherent coordination between the federal government and the state government agencies. I believe many of you know this Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Research Center. I highlighted a couple of statistics in terms of the US. Even though we knew there were cases in China in November, December, we did not take substantial preventative measures early enough. And especially in March, this is, I'm not sure if you knew, the system in the US is a spring break. Basically, students in the colleges and high schools are in the beaches, in the bars, in the restaurants, and that really increased substantial spread of virus sometime in March. And again, with the July 4th, additional early opening of economy in certain states. For example, Florida, we did not have many cases compared to New York and California, but right after early opening of the economy and the tourism sector, restaurants, unfortunately, the cases spiked substantially. So I highlighted briefly, CDC provided guideline, staged opening of the economy if you are meeting certain expectations. Still, certain localities, for example, build guidelines for the restaurants, 30%, 50%, depending on the cases they see, they can open, for example. The major decisions, especially for recently, reopening of the school system, reopening of the colleges and universities, and many of the governors emphasize reopening schools because these are, especially universities and colleges, these are somewhat engine of economy in many of the states. And many of the governors emphasize reopening those universities and colleges. And we've seen some substantial cases in different parts of the country in terms of increased cases at the campuses. Some early brief observation, I highlighted substantial delayed action from political leadership, unfortunately, both at mainly at the federal level and some at the state level. And again, it was an easy decision, balancing between economy, reopening economy, as well as health concerns. One of the major issues, especially at the federal level, not much reliance on science and evidence-based decision making. It was pretty much on politics. We need the economy open. Again, this is a very bad time for COVID-19 in the US as we're going through an election cycle, and November is the major election, both at the many states, counties, especially at the federal level. We do have a very professional emergency management system in the US, but again, professional emergency managers not quite utilized at the state and federal level, but we've seen some such good examples at the local level. For example, in the county, I live in Orange County in Florida, we had the emergency manager took the leadership role, coordinated action, and they've been actually following the individual cases. They've been making phone calls to make sure individuals are actually following the guidelines from the government in terms of self-quarantine, in terms of using face covering and physical distancing. One of the other major issues was the timely communication and public trust. So people did not trust too much, unfortunately, because of delayed information and inconsistent message coming from the national administration and the states, as well as from states to the local government. So we really need to have this critical information, well organized, based on evidence, based on science, well coordinated and disseminated in a way that the people at large can understand, as well as organizations at the different levels can understand and take an action. And I think this is, again, a major crisis and a disaster worldwide. And there are a lot of opportunities for all of us as scholars and practitioners and policymakers to learn, hopefully build capacity within the global system, as well as local and different countries, and design policies, hopefully will effectively help us in response to other disasters we might face in the future. With that, I'll stop in here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapıcı, for this great presentation. Again, we see some parallels and some differences, but I think the most important takeaway from the US case is that even if you have the best experts, even if you have the best epistemic community, even if you have the best response system, best resources for it, politics still matter, and politics can undo things. We also had elections in Korea, but I don't think it undid anything. We had the general elections, and I personally voted for the first time as a Korean citizen. And we have no confirmed cases related to this election, but right now in the United States, opening of economy and everything else is pretty much tied to even opening of the schools, which is also related to opening of economy, as Dr. Kapıcı pointed out, it's tied to the elections, and it's an important election in the United States because it's presidential elections, and it's whether Trump is re-elected or not, so it's quite vital as well. So this is very important. I think we had really different but also somehow connected experiences from different four very important countries regarding COVID-19, and we had the best experts to deliver presentations on these countries. And now I would like to turn to our discussants to discuss these cases more in detail and maybe to facilitate the discussion with the presenters through some questions. Our first presenter is Dr. Yoon Kyung-woo, a professor at the Department of Chinese Politics and Economy at the Global College of Humanities and Area Studies at Koongmin University, which is one of our co-hosts of this program. Dr. Yun?
Yeah, nice to see everyone. I'm Kyung Yun. It's the first time for me to see most of you. You know, you're 13 hours behind us because of the time difference. So I think you guys will soon become sleepy. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here among you. I have read an article Professor Kim and your colleagues have published recently. The world is in crisis due to the coronavirus pandemic. Globalization has reduced the distance between economies and societies, making contagious disease spread more effectively. The global challenges requiring cooperation across borders beyond the nation states are mounting. Your article and presentation today are very meaningful at a time of waning global cooperation, and then when countries need to work together to manage global issues. Professor Kim, I have 3 questions for you. Every country has its own approach. Many governments have resorted to strict measures, including a mass lockdown, desperate to contain the coronavirus. But such measures put great strain on economies and sometimes generate public backlash. South Korea has had success in containing the spread of the deadly virus without lockdowns, as Professor Kim mentioned. South Korea handling of the outbreak involving a highly coordinated government response that emphasizes transparency and relies heavily on public cooperation in place of the hardline measures such as lockdowns. Professor Kim mentioned the role and effect of the ICS, Incident Command System, and NIMS, National Incident Management System. In simple terms, containing an outbreak is about identifying and quarantining infected individuals as quickly as possible, preventing them from perpetuating viral transmission. In this process, the first and most important component is having a standard operating procedure. I see the South Korea has the standard operating procedure. So far, South Korea has demonstrated consistent standard operating procedures. This is not surprising, given that each has invested, South Korea has invested heavily in infectious disease control following prior experience with SARS and MERS. South Korea's standard operating procedures essentially called for 5 steps: aggressive transparent information campaign, high volume testing, quarantine of infected individuals, treatment of those in need, and disinfection of contaminated environments. One of the things that South Korea opened up testing centers that people could drive in and go through. Korean governments made it all free. And once they identify people, they put them into quarantine. And the ability to identify people who might be infected, to isolate them was probably very important and more difficult to do in settings like in the United States, where there's actually a lot more spread. How is it that South Korea was able to test? Has been testing something like 20,000 people per day. I think there has been 5,000 tests per million people in South Korea, just over 50 million people. South Korean government's collaboration with labs to provide access to testing and early diagnosis was a leading factor. What specifically is that South Korea is done that has helped keep the death toll much lower than other countries in similar positions. South Korea is a country that doesn't have the wealth. Many labs in the United States can run 1,000 more tests a day, containing the virus and reopening the economy, both depending on figuring out how to use the capacity. Many would argue the technology of the United States has been able to get tests out of the door so quickly, working test drive-throughs. And the United States and other countries haven't able to do that. Why? Why is it? That's my first question. My second question is about this. I think every country may have a different balance of the need of privacy and the need for public safety. And we do this all this time, right? I mean, in this case, on your left hand, you have the health of a nation or the health of the city. And on your right hand, you have individual rights. If controlling the virus, limiting its spread is felt by the government to be an overarching priority, you have to have laws in place that very carefully explain what the balance of privacy versus public safety is. And the Korean government actually had done that. South Korea has taken some extreme measures to that. Some people might say it's kind of, in a normal world, it's a violation of civil liberties or people's privacy. Since the outbreak, South Korea has been monitoring the movement of those people who have tested positive. Central and local governments and their agencies have been using information obtained from cell phone records, credit card receipt, and other private data to let the general public know where people have been, where there have been outbreaks down to. I think which seats people have sat in movie theaters. Is that the kind of sacrifices that a free society have to make in order to fight this pandemic? And my third question is about something like international cooperation. The United States and China relationship has rapidly deteriorated over the last several years. And thus far, COVID-19 has made things even worse. The COVID-19 pandemic may be a potential tragedy in the United States-China relations and a potential tragedy for the world. The interactions between the two sides, the finger pointing and politically driven accusations between these two leading powers is so far wasted historical opportunities for cooperation to tackle a common threat. They could have made a commitment to an international investigations of what went wrong in all countries during the early phases of the pandemic, but they didn't. They have done it. For some, they may still have a tendency to view international politics as a cold-blooded game rather than using the Corona-19 pandemic as a chance to collaborate with each other. Nationalist leaders in the United States and China may want to pretend they don't need the other, but South Korea's different approach has a different approach to China. South Korea's approach appeared to have played in its favor, highlighting South Korea and China relations. How is the coronavirus shaping South Korea's cooperation with China? I think it was the right decision for both the South Korean government and the private sector to provide China with millions of masks during the early stages of the virus outbreak in China. Despite South Korean conservatives' attacks on the administration, in return, the Chinese government and enterprises also provided millions of masks to South Korea. The South Sun City of Daegu, when it battled, contained a massive spike in COVID-19. Later on, China and South Korea have been cooperating during the pandemic through the exchange of medical information and support between both governments. A fast-track entry system for key business personnel, first established by China and South Korea, has effectively promoted the resumption of work and production and stabilized supply and industrial chains. South Korea is willing to further cooperate with each other, with China, on coronavirus prevention and control. The cooperation may include drug and vaccine research and development. Neighboring countries are effectively cooperating with each other against the coronavirus pandemic and ensure smooth operation of regional supply chain as shown in the fast track entry system for business travelers. The coronavirus can present an opportunity for South Korea and other countries to assist in the management of shared global change, and any effective strategy must face the reality that crisis responded by transnational threat will require the ability to work together. You know, no one will win the United States and China's corona contest amid the United States-China competition for hegemony. It is high time that both the United States and China reflect on themselves and come up with sincere and rational policies and strategies. The rise and fall of superpowers inevitably bring about fierce power competition, strategic confrontation. But the future of a new Cold War between the United States and China in the 21st century will only undermine the stability, peace, and prosperity of the world. The United States and China should recognize the need to strengthen the international community together instead of going it alone. They should be cooperative. Professor Kim mentioned the importance of effective national, regional, and local ICS within a country, as well as the need of coordination among the countries. My third question is whether the United States-China cooperation is still possible. Is the United States-China cooperation on the COVID-19 still possible? Is there any reason to hope that US cooperation with China is still possible, or it's getting worse? That's my last question. Again, I thank you for your insights on crisis management system of South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yoon.
Thank you. Maybe, Dr. Kim, maybe we can have your answers at the end. We can also hear from Dr. Chu first. And feel free to ask questions to other discussants as well, maybe Dr. Yoon at later stages of our discussion. With this, I will welcome Dr. Chu Jae-woo for his comments. And then after our discussion ends, I'll give a chance to presenters to respond to the comments and questions. Dr. Chu Jae-woo is an associate professor of Chinese foreign policy at the Department of Chinese Studies at Kyunghee University. Dr. Chu.
Hi, good evening and good afternoon, everyone. Glad to join this panel. And I don't know, after hearing 4 wonderful presentations, I truly appreciate your informative and insightful presentations. My impression is quite a paradox world we're living in. Because in this day and age of IT and globalization, it's unfortunate to see that we fail to fully utilize all the agencies and institutions and systems and network that we have all installed over the years. When it came to crunch time, we failed to utilize them to its full strength and maximize the privileges and the benefits that we can get from these institutions and system. I think the common thread from four presentations is lack of leadership and lack of coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. And, quite an unfortunate phenomenon that the world is witnessing. I think when we're talking about crisis management, I think we have to go along hand in hand with crisis prevention. And I think all the presenters shared an aspect on how the crisis prevention mechanism has failed implicitly, and by focusing on the failure of crisis management mechanism in respected countries. Crisis prevention, I think, in this case refers to the world level widespread of coronavirus. And I think it is quite obvious that despite the fact that we have all the institutions and system installed at the world level as well as regional level, but somehow they fail to activate and function in a way that prevented the virus from spreading at the global level. And what's happened has happened, and now it's time to efficiently manage this spreaded virus in respected country. But it seems like at the domestic level, the crisis prevention mechanism as well as crisis management mechanism has not worked to our expectation, which is quite unfortunate, and it's quite a paradox here, because we're supposed to have all these technology and information, and just like Professor Comfort pointed out, there was a cognition of the seriousness of the virus, but we failed to act in a coherent fashion, and that's quite unfortunate. I guess I can attribute to the failure of these institutions system going into activation to the fact that I think there was obviously blame game that went on both domestically and globally. And in defense of the blame game, countries tend to resort to nationalism, which is quite unfortunate to see. And in looking into the cause of the spread of the virus, for instance, China pleaded the fifth, and that's quite unfortunate. And when the countries employed means to overcome the crisis situation, it's unfortunate to see countries to resort to protectionism and statism. And I think the second factor that can be attributed to is the way the leadership and the leaders, including the governments, tend to politicize and securitize the situation here. By politicizing, I mean, obviously political interest, political factor were given priority when it comes to decision making. And second, economic interest and economic factor was given much more importance when it comes to decision making process over the socio and cultural factor here. And I think the third factor could be the way that international risk management, just like Professor Kapaku and Comfort pointed out, the system was there in WHO, but somehow it also failed to function the way it was designed to and supposed to be. At domestic level, obviously there was all countries are well equipped with CDC, and it seems like CDC's information and suggestions and policy recommendations were all ignored by the incumbent leaders, and the case does not exclude South Korea either. And the United States is quite an obvious one when we witnessed conflicts between Dr. Fauci and President Trump. My takeaway from this failure in our crisis prevention system and crisis management system is how we're going to really rebuild our leadership in times of crisis, and how we're going to operate and coordinate the system in a much more effective way as it was originally designed and built. I think lack of experience is not excusable anymore, because there was a cognition, just like Professor Comfort pointed out, that the seriousness of viruses was all recognized at one point or the other. However, we tend to refer to the previous cases in Spanish flu in 1917, 1918, and SARS, MERS, or Ebola, and so forth. But fortunately to human beings, these viruses were only regional in terms of the way the scope and the range the virus had spread it. But this time, coronavirus virus has spread to the unprecedented scale. I don't think there was a cognition, but I don't think that cognition recognized where the virus would have transpired into where it is now. So that's quite unfortunate. So I think my point is, after hearing your presentation, I was inspired that the world should be looking into at a much greater detail as to how we can build a better crisis prevention system along with crisis management system. And I have a couple of questions. One is to Professor Comfort. Looking at your presentation on Japan's case, it seems like in July it spiked up. It spiked in July, and obviously, I guess by listening to your presentation, I think we can divide the timeline between pre-Olympic cancellation decision as to post-cancellation period here. Do you see that taken as a factor here? Because it seems like Abe's government was all geared up to preventing the spread of virus in Japan so that it could go ahead with the Olympics. But once it was canceled, do you see that there was a loosening of the grip by the government after July? And the next question is to Professor Kakupu, and you said all the information from WHO and other related agencies were not really heeded by the Trump administration. Do you see presidential election was taken as a negative factor by the administration, or to their interest? Obviously, it was the most important factor, I guess, when it comes to this decision making here. So, do you see presidential election was overwhelmingly taken by the administration in heeding the information given by the WHO and other related agencies? And my last question is to Dr. Zhao. Do you see BRI taking a new turn when it comes to quarantine and health issues in its pursuit of prosperity and common development with the rest of the world? Do you see Chinese government recognizing the importance of quarantine and health and sanitary as at the par with economic interest, as well as prosperity of these governments, of these foreign countries that China is involved in BRI projects? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhu. Both Dr. Yun and Dr. Chu also pointed out some important aspects of crisis management and international cooperation. I'll leave it to the presenters to talk about their comments and questions, but very briefly, in Dr. Yun's comment and question, he talked about a very important aspect of crisis management here regarding privacy versus effective contact tracing. And in Dr. Chu's presentation, he talked about what Dr. Zhao also talked about, nationalism versus international cooperation, blame games versus international cooperation. So with this, I think I'll first leave it to Dr. Kim, because she received the most questions, I think. And after that, Dr. Comfort, Dr. Zhao, and Dr. Kapucu.
Thank you for the questions, Professor Yun and others. 3 questions was a lot of questions, so I might miss some really important point in the question, but this is my first reaction. The last 2 questions about whether US and China can rebuild a relationship in all these conflicts and everything in COVID-19. I truly don't believe I'm qualifying to answer the question, and I may have to ask you, Professor Yun, who knows more about international relations, or the Professor Luis or Kapucu, who might have a better experience with US and China relationship. So I'm gonna just leave that question to everybody rather than answering by myself. And if I understood correctly your first question, what makes a difference between South Korea versus US or other country in terms of how they respond to the COVID-19? This one I might be able to explain with my own opinion, but it's not based on any substantive knowledge about the country, because I've been here in the United States for the last 2 decades. And I rarely know about what's happening in the Korea. And so if you go to like details, what Korean government have done in terms of actions for various dimensions of epidemic, then my information might be less than what other people in South Korea might have. I pay attention to the organizing among the organization as a response to this epidemic over the last 5 years. So just telling that my knowledge is quite limited even for that first question. But I read an interesting article this morning. One of the researchers was saying that according to the most recent survey, South Korean people shows highest anxiety about this COVID-19, even though country has been managing so well compared to other countries. I cannot remember all those other countries that has been surveyed, but South Korea was like one of those top countries that people worrying about the COVID-19. At the same time, Korea is really in good shape in terms of the economy, according to the all kinds of report. But Koreans are worrying about the economic downturn and all that more seriously than anybody else. So by reading that article, I thought that there might be some cultural difference in terms of how people think about the environment that they are experiencing. I do not know why they think differently than other part of the world, but there is a certain types of culture that South Korea has been built in terms of how to respond to external environmental threats and so forth. That might be my humble opinion about what makes the difference between those different responses in different countries, Korea or US. Other people can help me to answer this question better after I finish the second piece that I might be able to answer a little better. The way that I heard your question is that the way that countries respond to this epidemic create a interesting question about what to choose or what is the trade-off by choosing one direction over another. And the first dimension that I heard there is that it's more about the community safety, community health versus individual freedom and individual right. This has been discussed in the United States so much. And I think I also found that my colleagues has a different viewpoint. What should be given more weight on it? One of the insightful comment that I got from that I recently exposed is that if someone asks what is more important, public health or quarantine or all kinds of this health-related safety issue versus economy, social dimension, and so forth, then what is more important is the second. Economy is important, social dimension is important, everything that we are dealing with in our life. That's really important dimension in terms of the priority. However, that priority would not be able to achieve if we fail to secure the public safety and individual health and all that. So even though, from my point of view, I'm fighting with my colleagues every day on this topic. I mean, even though we might feeling that we are losing important things that we used to get in terms of economy and social dimension, dealing with this type of pandemic and epidemic that is current right now should be prioritized more than the other dimension that might existing. And I think your question also has this question that Kadir was mentioning, which is like privacy versus tracing. And I've been thinking about this question while I was listening to your question. It's all depending upon, maybe I have to go to Luis's comments, it all depending upon how we perceive the situation, right? This COVID is really, if we really believe that this COVID is really impacting seriously for every country, then I would argue that giving up a little bit of privacy for the tracing would not be really problematic. However, not everybody would just share that current COVID-19 is really serious as much as I do or as much as others do. Then this issue of privacy might be understood differently. Since we didn't have this type of experience in the past, I think this is another area that we have to think about, this tension between privacy and health and public safety as one of those important topics. So I don't feel like I really gave a good answer for your complex questions, but I will stop here and then give others to add on or help me to answer better.
Okay, Dr. Comfort.
The mute, it's mute.
It's, now I think I'm very good. Thank you very much. Very interesting questions, very interesting comments by both of the commentators. And I think I'm going to refer to Dr. Yoon's question first. Is there hope for rebuilding the relationship between the US and China? And I would say yes, in 54 days, because we really have to look at the response of the US, I'm sorry to say, through the lens of Donald Trump and his major concern about his election. He was so criticized by his lax response, his unwillingness, his inability to understand and listen to the public health advisors, that he had to blame someone. Who could he blame? Oh, of course, he blames China. Probably he doesn't even believe that, but this becomes part of, I'm sorry to say, the political blame game. So I would say, you know, Chinese colleagues, Korean colleagues, Japanese colleagues, don't give up on the US. You know, have patience with us while we get through the election. The whole country has suffered. I mean, we've had to live with him now for almost 4 years. And the difficulty is we had to get through it legally. And it's taken a while. We tried impeachment. He's been very carefully protected by people who want him in that office, a small group. But I think, do remember that approximately 70% of the people disagree and do not believe what he says. So have patience with us, and I'm certain we can rebuild that. Secondly, I want to respond to Dr. Chu's question about the uneven dip in Japan. And actually, I think there are, you know, certainly a related issue and a compound issue in Japan, which is characteristic of these viruses and how they do escalate and how they do spread. Your observation about making the decision to cancel the Olympics, I think, is right. And indeed, that kept it low. And Abe was taking a very strong and very clear public position on that, wanting everyone to be quiet, not to have the virus escalate in Japan. But here we honestly have to take into account Abe's health, and that he was ill during this time and only announced his resignation because of his health. But it was during that time where, after the Olympic decision was made, he was not as visible, and he was not making the pleas to, you know, for cooperation, which was part of his nightly broadcast, as clearly and as strongly before. So in fact, I think the communication slipped in Japan as well as that. And then it's also, with these pandemics, it was literally the cumulative burden on this very limited structure of regional health centers. They were out of money. They were out of supplies. They were overburdened, short-staffed, and their people had been working nonstop, long hours, and you just get to the point of exhaustion in managing a pandemic where they hadn't been reinforced, and where in the society where Japan tends to operate as a society, and here I'm, you know, sort of speaking as an external observer, but there are many more silos. There's much less collaboration in Japan as a country. And I think that's exactly what is needed to manage a pandemic is collective action, where everyone understands the risk, understands what needs to be done, and in self-organizing in innovative ways is taking those steps. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next discussant.
Thank you very much, Dr. Comfort. Dr. Zhao.
Okay, for accuracy, may I speak Chinese and let my colleague to translate into English?
Sure.
Sure.
OK，这个首先我想谈一下这个国际合作抗疫的国际合作问题。
So first of all, I want to talk about the international cooperation on the anti-COVID-19.
这个最早的公共卫生国际合作呢，始于1851年啊。那个时候呢，是因为欧洲发生了将近50年的大规模的疫情，在法国巴黎1851年召开了首次公共卫生国际合作。
And the first such cooperation happened back in 1851. At that time, because European countries suffered from the pandemic, and then in Paris, the first such conference on international cooperation on health was held.
从1851年到1900年呢，12个欧洲国家，就公共卫生防疫呢开了14会议，但当时的特点呢是只讨论欧洲的问题，那么美洲国家的疫情，不予讨论。
And then before 1900, and 12 European countries held 10 conferences talking about only the pandemic issues in European continent. And at that time, the American pandemic and American disease topics were not discussed.
直到1946年啊，世界卫生组织成立之后啊，就是出现了全球领域的对公共卫生的协调性的抗议或合作。
And then, fortunately, in 1946, the WHO was set up. And then after that, globally, we had the coordination on public health.
刚才讲到了中美关系，其实在冷战时期啊，美苏关系也很紧张，但是70年代美苏合作消灭了天花。
And then just now, many experts talk about the China-US relationship. And even in the very coldest time during the Cold War period, there were cooperation between America and the former Soviet Union in 1970s. They cooperated to eliminate the pandemic, the 天花.
OK， 所以在这次疫情的时候啊，中国政府也非常希望同美国合作，但确实难度很大。
At that time, they eliminated smallpox, and this time, Chinese government is hoping to cooperate with the U.S. government, but it's really difficult.
其实今天这个议题，我觉得非常好的是什么呢？谈到了中国、日本、韩国还有美国，其实有3个亚洲国家。我觉得之所以抗疫，一个是自身抗疫有效，另外一个是这些3个国家团结合作，也很有效。我觉得很重要的就是除了制度之外的因素呢，还有文明。就是亚洲国家注重集体主义啊，家庭重于个人，那么集体也重于个人。
So that's why I think today's topic is really good, because we bring together the experts from China, Japan, and South Korea, and also other experts talking about the cooperation on health. Because I think that beside the cooperation with the help of institutions or systems, there is something which can also help, that is civilization or culture. In Asia, particularly in East Asia, we emphasize more on collective, and the family values are more important than the individuals.
所以刚才专家最后的一个问题问到"一带路"健康丝绸之路，其实"一带路"建设啊，它是一个多层面、多内容的一个倡议。它从最开始的时候就强调经济合作，包括生态文明。包括健康，都在强调。但是这次疫情啊，之后会放大，比如说健康丝绸之路、数字丝绸之路的比重。
Just now, our experts have talked about the BRI, and particularly in the future, whether there will be more health cooperation along the BRI countries. I think even from the beginning of the BRI, besides emphasizing the cooperation on the economy, we also talk about the protection of ecology and the protection of health of people. However, I think after this pandemic of COVID-19, public health cooperation and cooperation on digital or digitalization will be more emphasized.
我举一个小例子啊，就是在“一带一路”建设中，中国企业在海外、在全球啊，建立了将近100多个园区。但是在疫情之后啊，“一带一路”建设中，中国企业会更加注重去建立一些农业方面的园区，医疗和公共卫生服务方面的园区。
I give you some example. Along the Belt and Road, and Chinese enterprises have set up over 100 industrial parks. And I think after COVID-19 pandemic, there will be more such parks on agriculture, on public health, and the sectors related to public health.
包括加大这个跨境电商的这样的合作力度。
And even there will be more cooperation on the cross-border e-commerce.
那么现在中国政府这次抗疫也发现，就中医药的有效率很高，所以也希望在疫情之后啊，能够将中医药的国际化提上日程，所以它也属于公共产品。
At this time, the Chinese government even found that the traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, is really important and effective in treating the disease. And so maybe after the COVID-19, the use of the TCM will be more emphasized.
这个，所以这次会议啊，就我来说，就学习到了很多，也向各位专家表示敬意啊，谢谢。
And also, I have learned a lot from you, my distinguished experts. I want to say thank you to you, and you have my respect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. Last but not least, Dr. Kapıcı.
Thank you, Professor Yun and Professor Chu, for really good observation and putting those presentations together and asking tough questions. I'd like to highlight 4 points, starting with micro to global level. In terms of the US response, the questions on culture and resilience. We had the former FEMA administrator, Craig Fugate. He used to emphasize in his presentation as a FEMA administrator. He used to say, if people are not prepared, no one is prepared. How good the government is prepared, how good the administrative system is functioning. If the people, the citizens are not prepared, the system is not going to work. In the US, in this particular case, COVID-19, we did not have this experience. People hate masks, right? We didn't see that. You've seen in China, in Korea, in Japan, either for environmental reasons or health reasons, people are accustomed to use face covering. It wasn't the case in the US. And of course, the perception issue Kim mentioned is really serious. So we don't need to do it. I had friends from China and Korea. They called me, they emailed me, Naeem, you need to take a mask. You can't travel. You don't do this. You don't do that. Because they experienced it. But the micro level, individual level, people did not see the seriousness of COVID-19. You know, they went to restaurants, they went to beaches, they did not listen to guidelines coming from either the international community as well as from the federal government and the local communities. In terms of the second level, I think that was a question on politics and the way the personal interest, political gain, party interest versus the national interest. I think it was quite obvious at the federal level that it was normalized having 180,000, 200,000 citizens have died. That's expected. We put them in numbers, we didn't put them in human value. But if you look at the New York Governor Cuomo, for example, he repeatedly said, you might not like this. That's the policy. There is science behind it. There's evidence behind this. This is what we will do, and you have to follow. So we've seen this primarily public safety and people put first in terms of certain policy decisions and action from the government. At the global level, coordination, collaboration, and the framework Dr. Comfort built and presented briefly in terms of the Japan case, the cognition, communication, control, and collective action. If there's no trust, if there's no capacity, it is not going to work. Of course, there is at the global level economic interest of the countries versus the global interest. How do you balance this? At the state level, the public safety versus the economic reopening. I think there are those balances, and it's not easy decisions. For example, Russia claimed that they found medicine for COVID-19. No one excited because people don't trust, unfortunately. Right? So we have this substantial trust issue, at the global community as well. And the last point, I believe someone mentioned SDGs and sustainability. I was doing a couple research projects on SDGs, and this is a new topic, of course. They had a very good flexible system, 17 goals, and the 17th goal is actually partnership. So these are all challenging policy issues, and the United Nations SDG goals emphasize the role of partnership within the international community, as well as coordination between the United Nations agencies and the state agencies in different regions of the world. With that, I'll stop in here. And of course, the politics question, Dr. Comfort responded quite succinctly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapucu. We don't have much time left, and I'm sure everyone is tired, but we will receive a few questions from the audience, or if you have any questions to each other.
Okay, I have one more question for Professor Comfort.
Yes.
Yeah. A short question that has just come to my mind. South Korea also relied on a strong culture of community, much like Japan does, as Professor Comfort described in your presentation. South Korean people and governments, we practice social distancing. South Korean government aggressively pursued a test, trace, treat policy, so-called 3 T's. South Korea has that by and large did so. Most effective in older generations, younger people as so, just like in Japan, as you mentioned. Restaurants, bars, buses, trains, all were open. Rare instances of shutdowns in South Korea. You know, I think it is kind of interesting how South Korea has kept much less confirmed cases and deaths than Japan, that has similar cultural conditions. That's my question I would ask you.
Well, this is a difficult question, and actually we see a similar situation here in the US. So I'm here in California. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge behind me. And the response of the government in California was very, very different from the response of the government in, say, Oklahoma, or in Nebraska, or in Iowa, or in Texas, where finally they got caught up. But the governor in California is a Democrat. California is a virtually totally blue state. And in fact, everyone, and the governor gave clear, direct information. He had news broadcasts every single day, and he kept emphasizing, you know, wear a mask. He himself was wearing a mask. All the people around him were wearing masks. And these very important measures of keeping your distance and washing your hands, etc. More than that, this, of course, is California with Silicon Valley just down the road. And he set up an excellent, very extensive web page where he had all of the rules, he had all of the questions. He invested a significant amount. He was able to go to Google and Oracle and the tech firms, get them to invest, to contribute to the development of this really broad measure of communication through California. And so initially in California, they brought the count down. And California, it's 4 million people. It's the largest state of the union. And he was very much aware that if they took action early, they could keep the count down. But the interesting part is it's one state, and it borders on Arizona, and it borders on Mexico. And the people in Arizona with the Republican governor were not wearing masks, and they were going to barbecues, and they were doing all kinds of things, and they were traveling to you know, across the border to San Bernardino County, Imperial County, which is the largest county on the border. And that created a huge spike in California and undid much of the work that Newsom had done, because then the people in California traveled from Imperial County to Los Angeles, which of course is the largest city, and the spikes, you know, increased again. So the lesson, and I believe this was Dr. Zhao that mentioned, or actually Yushim Kim, that you can't do it just once. You have to do it every day until you get a vaccine or you get everyone doing it. And this is the collective part. And this is the hard part actually in the US, because in California, people are used to listening to evidence and their politicians telling them the truth and not making things up and telling them to inject bleach into themselves, you know, which is one of the more absurd lines from Donald Trump. But that is culture. And I think what we need to think about is how do we build this global culture? And what really interests me is how do centers like yours, the Center for the Silk Road Initiative, or the center in China, or I was in Nanjing University last summer with the center that is focused on the same role, the center I used to direct at the University of Pittsburgh, the center that Dr. Capuccio is directing it at the University of Central Florida, where we have people who are more attuned to evidence and more interested in building a collaborative learning process. I think the leadership has to come from these interdisciplinary centers where you can pull together people who have skills in medicine, public health, public affairs, computer science, and, you know, sociology, and begin to think about how do we educate whole nations in order to recognize risk and act more quickly. So that's my soapbox. I'm sorry to say. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience as well? Dr. Kim, you want
Not the question. I want to add one thing that I thought it's really interesting in this case. We talked about how to respond a lot, right? But I think there is a very unique thing that we, in this event, which is that scientific uncertainty that we didn't think about. If it was just flu, if it was just influenza that we know of, which we're having, every country having every year, every winter, it's not going to create this type of chaos. This is infectious disease, yes, the same type, like if you think, even though we are not a medical expert, it's like a similar sort of, same kind of disease, but this is an emerging infectious disease that is transmitted between human and animals and so forth. We don't know how those things are transmitted. We don't know what the key parameter looks like. We don't know many of the dimensions that make science must be progressed along with this event, which is not, science is not working like that. Science takes decades or 2 decades, 3 decades, but we cannot do science like this in this particular case with a lot of uncertainty on the disease. Then we cannot give a consistent message. I mean, who would disagree? Government, if the government give a consistent message, yes, people will trust the government, but how are we gonna give a consistent message? Wear the mask, do not wear the mask, wear the mask, do not wear the mask. I mean, knowledge is progressing as our science progress. This is the unique challenge that we cannot discount. It's not like some of the diseases that we know very well, or some of the events that we know very well. There is a huge uncertainty along with this source of the problem that we are dealing with.
Thank you very much.
Mute, it's mute.
Is it mute still?
Luis is mute. She's trying.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
If I may, I would like to respond to that. Yushim, I think you're exactly right. And I think the degree of uncertainty has really, been exacerbated by the size and the scale and the fact that this is a global pandemic and people don't understand, when it will be over. If you could give them a day certain, on November 3rd, it'll be over. On December 31st, it'll be over. Most people could live with that, but it's knowing that they don't know and trying to live their lives in ordinary ways when they still don't know, I think is very difficult. So in this situation, trust of leaders, as Dr. Capuzzo has said, is really important. And how do you build trust with leaders? California's Governor Newsom has made mistakes, but what he has done is the next day he's come back and said, look, our computer program in Los Angeles, really had errors in it and we had to correct it. And so this is what we did and this is the correction, and people can accept that. But if you make things up, if you blame anybody else except yourself, if you don't take responsibility for what your particular position expects, then this is where the trust in the US of the current president is really at an almost all-time low. And no one's going to believe him. No one's going to listen. And, what we probably tell people around the world is wait 54 more days. But literally recognizing the uncertainty leads us back to a learning process. We don't know what it is, but we can learn. We can inquire, and we can produce and share the information, the discoveries that we have, and creating an expectation that we will learn and figure it out is more hopeful than pretending it's somebody else's fault. And I see this as a challenge, but I also see this as a primary role of universities and research centers.
Very much, Dr. Comfort. I think you two both raised very important points in line with also what Dr. Naim Capuzzo said earlier. Public cooperation is very important to overcome this problem. Public trust is very important for public cooperation. Consistent communication is very important, but then scientific consensus in the discourses is very important, and it's very difficult in this scientific uncertainty that we are living in. But Dr. Comfort also raised a very important point that even if there are mistakes within the discourses, or even if we are still in a learning process, we are learning new things, accepting mistakes is very important. And I think this goes back to what I think Dr. Chu said earlier, sorry, Dr. Yoon said earlier about transparency in communication. So accepting mistakes has something to do with this transparency and being open and communicating consistently with the public at the government level. So thank you very much. I just tried to wrap it up surrounding this specific discussion point. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Do you have any last comments or last words, presenters or discussants?
Well, I would just like to thank every single member on this panel. I thought it was really very interesting, and it was very interesting to me to see and to hear the different perspectives. And I hope that, and I'm confident, Kadir, that your center will continue to develop more kinds of dialogue like this. And I think this is a very constructive, helpful way to build the kind of commitment to international dialogue and international collaboration and international cooperation that we need, not only to deal with COVID-19, but for even larger challenges like climate change.
Yes, yes, thank you very much.
I also would like to express thank you for everybody. It was like eye-opening experience because I never expected I'm going to confront the nationalism question in the conversation of COVID-19. Thank you for opening up my mind with different dimensions.
And again, thank you, Kadir, and everybody else in the panel organizing this. It was quite a good experience.
Thank you very much for all of your participation and very insightful presentations and discussions. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone for making time, and it's quite late in the United States, so despite the time difference, despite my miscalculation of the time, thank you very much everyone for your participation, and I'm looking forward to maybe meeting again in the future, to follow up maybe program in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Bye. 안 들립니다. 팀장님?
네.
아까 뭐라고 하셨어요? 안 들렸어요.
뭐라고 하셨죠? 회의 종료할까요?
예, 수고 많으셨습니다.
예, 카dir 교수님 고생 많았어요.
아, 감사합니다, 소장님.
예,
수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 예.
예.